The moment Grace Cooper stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she pressed her lips together in a firm line and told herself that no amount of wide sky or warm-eyed men was going to make her forget why she had come. She had come to work. Not to wed, that distinction mattered to her more than most people could understand, and she had rehearsed it silently for the better part of 3 days while the coach rattled westward from St. Louis, shaking loose everything that had once felt certain about her life. Her teaching certificate was folded inside her coat pocket, crisp and official, bearing the seal of the Missouri State Board of Education. She had a letter of hire from the school board of Caldwell itself, signed by a Mr. Harold Prentice, who had written enthusiastically about the town's growing population and its desperate need for a qualified schoolteacher. She had a small trunk, a few decent dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, and the kind of determination that women in her family wore like armor. She did not have a husband, and she intended to keep it that way. Her mother had married young and spent the better part of her life bent over a washboard and a cook stove, loving a man who was good enough but restless as river water. Her older sister had married a merchant in Jefferson City who had seemed promising on paper, but turned out to be the sort of man who liked his supper on the table at exactly 6 o'clock, and his opinions respected at all hours. Grace had watched both of these women diminish, slowly and quietly, the way a candle burns down when you are not paying attention. She had decided, somewhere around her 23rd birthday, that she would rather burn on her own terms. The schoolteacher position in Caldwell was exactly that, her own terms. She pulled her travel bag from the boot of the coach and looked out at the main street stretching before her. Caldwell in 1878 was not a small place, not exactly. It sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail, which meant it breathed with the energy of cattle drives, of Texas cowboys riding north, of merchants and saloon keepers and gamblers who followed the money wherever it moved. The street was wide, the kind of wide that made you feel like the sky was pressing down from every side. A row of false-fronted buildings stood at attention on either side of the packed earth road. She could see a general store, a hotel, a barber shop, 2 saloons that she could count from where she stood, and a livery stable at the far end from which came the sound of a horse registering a complaint about something. It was loud and dusty and smelled like animals and wood smoke and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify, and Grace Cooper squared her shoulders and felt something unlock in her chest that she had kept tightly sealed for most of her life. She liked it. She wasn't going to tell anyone that, but she liked it. She was still standing there, bag in hand, blinking at the afternoon light, when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her, and a voice that she would later describe, privately and only to herself, as the kind of voice that made you want to turn around even when you were trying very hard not to. "You look like somebody who just got told the hotel is full." She turned. She turned because she was not the kind of woman to be caught off guard and not respond, and because the voice had been wry and warm in equal measure and she was curious by nature. The man standing on the boardwalk was perhaps 28 or 30, lean in the way that men who work outdoors are lean, with dark hair curling slightly where it came out from under the brim of his hat and eyes the color of good coffee in morning light. He had a badge pinned to his vest, she noticed. Deputy Sheriff. He was holding a tin cup in one hand and looking at her with an expression that managed to be respectful and amused at the same time, which she found simultaneously irritating and interesting. "The hotel may well be full," she said. "I haven't checked yet." "It is," he said without any particular satisfaction. "Cattlemen came through yesterday, filled it up, but Mrs. Elspeth Hale on Birch Street takes in boarders and she sets a good table. I can walk you over if you like." She looked at him steadily. "That's very kind, but I am perfectly capable of finding Birch Street on my own." "I'm sure you are," he said, and the amusement in his expression deepened just slightly enough for her to notice. "It's 3 blocks east and then left at the livery. The sign out front says Hale. You can't miss it." "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." He touched the brim of his hat in the easy way men did out here, a gesture she was still getting used to, and she turned to go. She had made exactly 2 steps when he said, "Are you the new school teacher?" She stopped. She looked back. "What makes you think that?" "Because you're the only person I've seen step off a stagecoach looking like they came here on purpose rather than accident," he said. "Most people who land in Caldwell either followed the cattle or followed somebody else's dream. You look like you're following your own." That stopped her more thoroughly than she wanted to admit. She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended to. "I am the new school teacher," she said. "Grace Cooper. Reuben Donovan," he said. "Deputy Sheriff, for whatever that's worth out here." "I imagine it's worth quite a lot," she said, though she said it in the neutral tone she used when she was not certain whether she was paying a compliment or simply stating a fact. He smiled, and it transformed his face in a way that she filed away in the back of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at directly. "Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Cooper." She walked to Mrs. Hale's boarding house on Birch Street, and she did not look back. She told herself she wasn't looking back because she didn't need to, and if she thought about that voice for another half-second before she fell asleep that night in the small, clean room Mrs. Hale had shown her to, well, that was simply the natural consequence of meeting a stranger on her first day in an unfamiliar place. It meant nothing. She was tired. The stagecoach had been brutal. She slept very well. The schoolhouse in Caldwell was a single room on the edge of town, built from rough-cut timber that had weathered to a soft gray, with 4 windows that let in good light in the mornings and a cast-iron stove in the corner for the cold months. There were 12 desks arranged in uneven rows, a blackboard that had been inexpertly painted onto one wall, and a supply cabinet that she discovered on her first morning contained 3 primers, a cracked slate, half a box of chalk, and a dead mouse. She removed the dead mouse, opened all 4 windows, rearranged the desk so that the light fell properly, and wrote her name on the blackboard in her best hand. By the time the children arrived, the room looked like something a teacher actually worked in, and she stood at the front of it and felt the same satisfaction she always felt when order emerged from disorder. There were 14 children ranging from 6 to 15, and they were, collectively, the most interesting classroom she had ever taught. They were the children of cattlemen and merchants and a blacksmith and a woman who ran one of the saloons, and they brought with them the particular quality of children raised on the edge of things, a watchful alertness combined with a kind of fearlessness that Grace found genuinely admirable. They were also, in several cases, significantly behind where they ought to have been in their reading and arithmetic, which gave her work to do, which was exactly what she had wanted. She threw herself into it with everything she had. Within a week she had established a routine, a curriculum, and a rapport with most of her students that satisfied her professional standards. Within 2 weeks, she had sent a politely worded but firm letter to Harold Prentice, noting that the school's supply situation was inadequate and requesting a budget allocation for additional primers, new chalk, and a proper map of the United States. Prentice, who was a good-natured man in his 50s, who ran the town's general store in addition to his school board duties, read the letter, laughed once, and sent over a crate of supplies the following morning. She had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks when she saw Reuben Donovan again. She was coming out of Prentice's general store with a paper-wrapped parcel of new slates under one arm when he nearly walked into her on the boardwalk, catching himself just in time and reaching out one hand to steady the slates which had wobbled. "Miss Cooper," he said. "Deputy Donovan," she said. They stood for a moment in the awkward geometry of 2 people who have nearly collided. "I hear the school is going well," he said. "My neighbor's boy Thomas, he's in your class. His mother says he came home last week and read 3 sentences to her at supper without being asked." Something warm moved through her at that. She kept her expression professionally pleasant. "Thomas is a hard worker. He only needed the right materials." "She cried," Reuben said. "His mother, she said she'd been waiting 2 years to hear him read." Grace looked down at the slates for a moment and then back up. "That is the whole point," she said quietly. "I know it," he said. She shifted the parcel. He shifted slightly aside on the boardwalk to let her pass, and then he said, in that same easy way he seemed to say everything, "Mrs. Hale is having a supper gathering on Saturday. She invites the whole street. You should come if you haven't been before. Good food and decent company." "I'll consider it," she said. She went. Of course she went. Mrs. Hale's supper gatherings were, she discovered, a genuine institution on Birch Street. A long table set up in the backyard when the weather permitted, neighbors bringing dishes, conversation flowing freely across the kind of social lines that were still relatively rigid back in St. Louis. The blacksmith sat next to the dressmaker. The cattleman's wife talked across the table with a woman who ran a laundry. And Reuben Donovan sat at the far end of the table across from Grace Cooper and told a story about a runaway mule that had disrupted an entire cattle drive last autumn that was so genuinely funny that she laughed before she could think about whether she wanted to. He looked at her when she laughed, and there was something in his eyes that she didn't know what to do with, so she turned to the woman beside her and asked about her garden. His story, it turned out, was not merely entertaining. He had a gift for it. He told stories the way a good writer writes, with a sense of when to slow down and when to move quickly, with an ear for the detail that made a scene real rather than merely described. She found herself listening even when she was pretending to attend to something else. She learned things about him in fragments over the following weeks, the way you learn things about people in a small town, whether you intend to or not. He had come to Caldwell 4 years earlier from a small farming community in eastern Tennessee, following a brother who had since moved on to Colorado. He had taken the deputy position because the sheriff at the time had needed someone who could be trusted, and he had stayed because he had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he liked the town. He was good at his job, which in Caldwell in 1878 meant being good at managing the particular chaos of cattlemen who arrived in large numbers and felt entitled to make their presence felt in ways that occasionally required intervention. He was not married. She absorbed this information with careful neutrality. He was 29 years old. She was 23. She absorbed this information too. She did not, she told herself firmly, think about these facts with any particular significance. She was here to teach. She was building something for herself in this place, something that was hers alone, and she was not going to compromise it for a pair of coffee-colored eyes and a voice that could make even a story about a mule sound like something worth remembering. It was her students who complicated this excellent plan first. Abigail Monroe was 12 years old and the daughter of the town's barber, a sharp-minded girl who had already read every book in Caldwell and several that Grace had lent her from her own trunk, and who had decided at some point that her schoolteacher's personal life was an interesting puzzle worth solving. "Is it true you're not going to get married, Miss Cooper?" Abigail asked one afternoon in late May, when the other children had gone home and she had stayed to help stack primers. "Where did you hear that?" Grace asked. "Mother told Mrs. Alcott at the dress shop that you'd said so to Mrs. Hale," Abigail said, with the precision of a child who pays close attention to adult conversations. "She said it was a shame." "It is not a shame," Grace said pleasantly. "I am a schoolteacher. That is my profession and my purpose." "Deputy Donovan is very handsome," Abigail said, with the scientific detachment of someone reporting an observable fact. "Stack the primers alphabetically by title," Grace said. Abigail stacked them, smiling to herself in a way that 12-year-olds did when they were fairly certain they had made a point. June arrived with heat that pressed down on Caldwell like a hand, and with it came the cattle drives in full force. The Kishom Trail was at the height of its activity in those years, with great herds coming up from Texas through Indian Territory and into Kansas, and Caldwell, sitting at the edge of it all, swelled with cowboys and the commerce they brought. Main Street became louder and more complicated. The saloons stayed open later. Reuben's hours grew longer, and she would sometimes see him riding through town at dusk with that particular watchful quality that law enforcement had when things were on the edge of manageable. She noticed his hours because she often sat at the window of her room at Mrs. Hale's in the evenings to plan her lessons, and the window looked out onto the street. That was the only reason she noticed. On a Thursday evening in early June, she was coming back from the schoolhouse where she had stayed late to work on end-of-term assessments, and she heard raised voices from the alley beside the hardware store. She slowed because one voice sounded young, and she recognized it. Thomas Alcott, her student, was backed against the alley wall by two men who were very clearly not from Caldwell, trail dusty and smelling strongly of the saloon down the street. They were laughing at him, not violently but cruelly, in the particular way that adults sometimes had with children when they wanted to feel large. Thomas was 8 years old, and he was pressing himself against the wall with his chin up in a way that broke her heart a little. She walked into the alley without thinking about whether she should. "Thomas," she said, "I've been looking for you. Your mother asked me to send you home directly." Both men turned. She met their eyes without flinching, which was easier than it might have been because she was genuinely angry, and genuine anger has a clarifying effect. "Evening, ma'am," said one of them, the one who had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "Good evening," she said. "I need to walk this young man home." She held out her hand. Thomas took it immediately and with a grip that was tighter than it should have needed to be. She turned and walked out of the alley, and the men, to their credit, let them go. She walked Thomas to his mother's house 3 streets over, and Mrs. Alcott came to the door with flour on her hands and took one look at her son's face and then at Grace and said, "Thank you," in a way that carried about 6 things at once. Walking back to Mrs. Hale's, she ran into Reuben at the corner of Main and 2nd. He was coming from the direction of the saloons, and he looked at her, and then at the direction she had come from with the particular attention of someone who notices things. "Long evening," he said. "Somewhat," she said. She told him what had happened because he was the deputy and it seemed like the sort of information he should have. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he nodded once, the way a man nods when he is deciding something. "I'll have a word with those fellows," he said. "They weren't violent," she said, "just unpleasant." "Unpleasant is still worth a word," he said. They walked in the same direction for half a block before she realized they were both heading toward Birch Street, which made a kind of sense, since he also boarded with a family on that street, which she knew because Mrs. Hale had mentioned it in passing approximately 3 weeks ago. She had not filed this information away deliberately. It had simply stayed. "You walked into that alley alone," he said, not accusatory, just observational. "There were 2 of them and one 8-year-old boy," she said. "There were 2 of them," he said, "and one of you." "I'm aware of the arithmetic," she said, "but standing in the street calculating odds while a child is frightened seemed like the wrong choice." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right, it was the right choice." She glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead, but there was something in his expression, a kind of consideration, as though he were revising something. "I'm glad you were here," he said. "I should have been on that block earlier." There was a weight to that admission that surprised her. She had expected him to say something reassuring or deflecting. Instead, he had simply acknowledged his own absence as a failure, quietly and without drama. "You cannot be everywhere," she said. "No," he said. "But I can do better on the East End during trail season." They reached the corner of Birch Street and parted ways with a nod, and Grace went upstairs to her room and sat at her window and stared at her lesson plans and thought about a man who, when confronted with his own shortcoming, simply decided to do better. She told herself this was admirable in a purely general and professional sense. She told herself this very firmly. The 4th of July celebration in Caldwell that year was a proper event, with a brass band that had been imported from Wichita, tables of food set up in the street, fireworks organized by the town council, and most of the population gathered together in a spirit of festive, if occasionally raucous, communal goodwill. Grace attended because her students were performing a short recitation she had prepared with them, and because Mrs. Hale had told her it would be rude not to come, and also because she wanted to, which she was beginning to admit to herself more often when she wanted things. The recitation went beautifully. Thomas read 2 entire paragraphs from the Declaration of Independence without stumbling once, and his mother cried again, and Grace stood at the side of the gathering and felt a fierce, clean pride in her work. Reuben appeared beside her somewhere in the middle of the brass band's 3rd number, holding 2 glasses of lemonade and offering her one without preamble. She took it. "Thank you, Thomas was exceptional," he said. "All of them were," she said. "They were," he agreed. "But Thomas was exceptional." They stood together in the comfortable way that people sometimes find when enough small moments have accumulated between them that silence no longer requires explanation. The band played something rousing and the crowd clapped and cheered, and the summer sky was enormous and gold and blue above Caldwell, and Grace Cooper stood in it and thought, with a surprise that she did not suppress quickly enough, that she was happy. She was happy. Here. In this dusty, complicated, loud town at the edge of the cattle trails, with chalk on her fingers and this man standing close enough beside her that she could hear him breathing. She turned to look at him and found that he was already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I should check in with the sheriff," he said, and his voice was slightly different, something careful in it that had not been there before. "He worries during celebrations." "Of course," she said. He left, and she finished her lemonade, and she stared at the middle distance for a long moment before the Monroe children came running up to tell her that Abigail had won the spelling contest, and she returned to being a school teacher. On the walk home that night, with the fireworks still occasionally cracking in the distance, Mrs. Hale walked beside her and said, with the gentle directness of a woman who had been watching people for 60 years, "He is a good man, you know." "I'm sure he is," Grace said. "He hasn't looked at anyone the way he looks at you since he came to Caldwell," Mrs. Hale said. "Mrs. Hale," Grace said. "I'm just telling you what I see," Mrs. Hale said, unruffled. "You can do whatever you like with it." July settled into August, and August in Kansas was something that had to be experienced to be believed, a heat that was physical and relentless, and that turned the air above the street into something that shimmered and moved. Grace learned to arrive at the schoolhouse early while it was still cool, to open all the windows and let whatever breeze existed move through the room before the sun climbed too high. She shortened the afternoon lessons and sent the children home at 2 instead of 3. She soaked a cloth in the water bucket and pressed it to the back of her neck during the long afternoons at her desk. She was doing exactly this one afternoon when she heard a knock at the schoolhouse door. She said, "Come in," and Reuben came in. He was off duty, she could tell by the absence of his badge and the slightly easier quality of how he carried himself. He had something in his hand that turned out to be a book, held carefully, and he looked around the empty schoolroom with the expression of someone who respects a space. "Am I interrupting?" he said. "The children left 2 hours ago," she said. "What is that?" "A book," he said. He held it out. "I found it at Prentice's. Came in with a shipment meant for somewhere else. He was going to sell it, but I thought your school might use it more." She stood and took it. It was a natural history of North America, illustrated, beautifully printed, the kind of book that cost real money. She turned it over in her hands and felt the familiar pleasure of a well-made object. The illustrations alone were extraordinary, detailed engravings of the prairie landscape, the rivers, the wildlife, the geological formations of the territories. "This is a wonderful book," she said. "I thought so," he said. He looked at the bookshelves she had organized along one wall, the neat rows of primers and readers, and the geography book she had ordered from St. Louis. "You've done a lot with this place." "It needed doing," she said. "Most things do," he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the afternoon light coming through the west windows, and it caught the dust motes in the air around him and made the room feel golden and still. "Sit down if you like," she said, because it seemed rude to leave him standing, and because she found that she wanted him to stay. "I was going over the autumn curriculum." He sat in the chair she usually kept in the corner for parents, and he watched her work for a while in the comfortable silence they seemed to be good at. After a time he said, "Do you ever miss St. Louis?" She considered the question honestly. "I miss certain things. I miss the library. I miss the sound of the city in the morning." She paused. "But I don't miss it the way I thought I would." "Why not?" "Because what I wanted was never actually in St. Louis," she said. "What I wanted was the work, and the work is here." "Just the work," he said, and there was something careful in the question, a kind of deliberate neutrality that was not actually neutral at all. She looked at him for a moment. "I came here to make something for myself," she said. "Something that belongs to me. I watched women in my life hand themselves over to other people's plans and spend their whole lives in service to someone else's idea of what they should be." She said it steadily, because it was the truth, and she had never been afraid of the truth. "I don't intend to do that." He was quiet, listening in the way he listened, completely without the half-present quality that many people had when they were simply waiting for you to finish. "That makes sense to me," he said at last. She had expected something else, an argument, a reassurance, a redirection. She had not expected simple, honest acknowledgement. "It does," she said. "My mother worked herself to nothing for a house and a family and a husband who was not unkind but who didn't think to ask her what she wanted," he said. "I watched that too." He looked at the window, at the gold light. "I think a person ought to know what they want and pursue it, man or woman." She set down the curriculum papers. "And what do you want, Deputy Donovan?" He turned from the window and looked at her, and she read something in his face with the clarity that comes from paying attention to a person for 4 months, that combination of honesty and care and the particular vulnerability of someone who is about to say a true thing. "Something I'm not sure I should want," he said quietly, "because I think you might have a very reasonable objection to it." The room was very still. The dust motes moved in the golden light. "I see," she said. "I'm not asking you to change your mind about anything," he said. "I just wanted you to know." She held the natural history book in both hands and looked at him and thought about walls and the things that get lost when you build them too high. "I'll think about what you've said," she said at last. He nodded and stood and touched the brim of his hat in that easy way, and left her to the afternoon quiet and the curriculum she no longer had any concentration for. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She thought about it while teaching the children the names of the major rivers of North America, using the beautiful illustrated book. She thought about it while planning a reading lesson that used the Declaration of Independence as its primary text, because if Thomas could read the Declaration, Thomas could read anything. She thought about it in the mornings over Mrs. Hale's strong coffee, and in the evenings at her window, and in the space between sleeping and waking when thoughts moved without the supervision of good judgment. She thought about Reuben Donovan, who had walked into an alley to check on a child, who had admitted his own failure without excuse and decided to do better, who had listened to her talk about the work she loved without once suggesting she should want something else, who had brought her a beautiful book because he thought she might need it, and who had not framed this as a favor that required anything in return, who had told her his own truth quietly and then given her the space to do with it what she chose. She thought about her mother and her sister, and she thought about the difference between a life handed over and a life chosen. She thought about the wall she had built and why she had built it, and whether the reason she had built it was still entirely applicable. She was sitting on Mrs. Hale's back porch in the last of the August evening, when she came to the conclusion that had probably been building for months. The night air was still warm but no longer brutal, and the stars over Caldwell were extraordinary, that vast western sky absolutely crowded with light, and she sat with her coffee and thought clearly, for the first time, about what she actually wanted. She wanted her school. She wanted her work and her students, and the satisfaction of watching a child arrive at a word they had not been able to reach the day before. She wanted this life she was building on her own terms, in this loud, dusty town that she had somehow, without planning to, come to love. And she thought that maybe, perhaps, possibly, Those things were not incompatible with wanting Reuben Donovan to sit beside her on this porch. Not as a claim upon her freedom, not as a replacement for the life she was building, but as an addition to it, as a companion in it. She turned this thought over carefully, examining it from all angles for the flaws she expected to find. She found fewer than she had anticipated. In the first week of September, when the heat had finally broken and the air had taken on the earliest suggestion of autumn, she went looking for him. She found him at the sheriff's office, a solid square building on the west end of Main Street, sitting on the bench out front with a cup of coffee and a ledger he was annotating with the focused expression of someone who was not enjoying administrative work. He looked up when she approached, and his expression changed in the way she had learned to watch for. "Miss Cooper," he said. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, because she had never been one for elaborate approaches. He set down the ledger. About what you said in the schoolhouse." He waited. "I am not changing my mind about who I am," she said. "I am a school teacher. That is my work and my profession, and I intend to keep it as long as the school board will have me." "I know that," he said. "And I am not interested in the kind of arrangement where I become a secondary part of someone else's life," she said. "I wouldn't want that," he said, and she believed him, which was remarkable. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had waited and listened and told her the truth and then given her room to decide. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to have supper with you, not at Mrs. Hale's gathering, just supper with you." The smile that moved across his face was slow and genuine, and reached all the way to those coffee-colored eyes, and she felt something shift in her chest like the last lock on a door she had been keeping closed for longer than strictly necessary. "I would like that very much," he said. They had supper at the hotel dining room, which by September had vacancies again since the peak of trail season was passing, and the room was quiet, and the food was better than she had expected, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about Tennessee and Missouri and the strange magnetic pull of the Western territories that had brought them both here. They talked about books, and she discovered that he had read more than she had given him credit for, a practical reader, the kind who read for information as much as pleasure, history and natural science and the law. They talked about the school, and he asked questions that were not polite conversation questions but actual questions, the kind that came from genuine interest, about what she was teaching and why, and what she hoped her students would carry forward. He asked about her family, and she told him about her mother and her sister with the honest acknowledgement of love and grief, and the complicated legacy of watching people you love make their peace with less than they deserved. He listened, and at the end of it he said quietly, "That's a heavy thing to carry." "It's also a clarifying thing," she said. "Both can be true," he said. She told him, because she wanted to, about the night before she had left St. Louis, when she had sat in the dark of her childhood bedroom and written out a list of every reason why she should stay and every reason why she should go, and how the list for going had been shorter but had weighed more. He laughed at the image of her with her list, not mockingly but warmly, and then he said that he had stood on the road out of eastern Tennessee with his brother and done something similar in his head, and how he still could not entirely explain what had made him keep walking west. "Something you can't name yet," she said. "Something I'm beginning to name," he said, and looked at her in a way that was clear and direct and without pretense. They walked back to Birch Street under the September stars, and at the corner he stopped. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "Would you like to do this again?" She looked up at him in the dark, at the familiar shape of his face and the honest simplicity of the question. "Yes," she said, "I would." October came in cool and gold, and with it a shift in the rhythm of Caldwell that Grace had not quite anticipated. The trail season wound down. The cattlemen and cowboys who had filled the town all summer moved on, and Caldwell contracted into its winter self, quieter and more intimate, a real town rather than a way station. She found she preferred this version. The schoolwork deepened, the children more settled, longer hours at their desks, the reading improving across the board in ways that made her genuinely proud. She and Reuben took supper together twice a week, and then 3 times, and then the division between work and personal time began to blur in the easy way that happens when someone becomes a natural part of your days. He would stop by the schoolhouse on his morning rounds, and she would have a second cup of coffee waiting, not because she had planned to, but because she had started making it before she consciously thought about why. He helped her carry a new bookshelf she had ordered from the general store to the schoolhouse on a Saturday morning, and they spent 2 hours arranging books on it, while arguing pleasantly about whether geography or natural science was the more useful subject for 12-year-olds. And she realized at some point in the middle of this argument that she was happier in that moment than she had been in a very long time. On a Saturday afternoon in late October, he took her riding. She had ridden before, in a general and infrequent way, and she was not good at it, which she told him plainly when he arrived at Mrs. Hale's with 2 horses from the livery. He said he would take it slowly, which he did, and they rode out of town along the creek that ran south of Caldwell and into the open prairie, and she understood, for the first time, what the landscape actually was when you were in the middle of it rather than looking at it through a window. It was enormous. It was the most enormous thing she had ever seen. This flat golden country stretching in every direction to a horizon so far away, it seemed like a theoretical concept rather than an actual place. The grass moved in the wind in long, slow waves, and the sky above it was the deep blue of October, and there was no sound except the wind and the horses and somewhere behind them the distant threat of the town. She pulled up her horse and sat still for a moment and just looked at it. "What are you thinking?" he said, pulling up beside her. "That I understand why people keep coming here," she said. "You cannot see this from St. Louis. You cannot imagine it." "No," he said. "It makes you feel very small," she said, "but not in a frightening way, in the way that is accurate." He looked at her with that quality of attention she had come to recognize as distinctly his. "That's exactly it," he said. They rode further along the creek, and he showed her where the creek widened into something almost worth calling a river, with cottonwood trees turning gold along the banks, and they dismounted and walked for a while, leading the horses, and she felt the prairie wind move her hair and thought with a clarity that required no effort at all that she was in the right place. Not just the right place geographically, the right place in every sense that mattered. He stopped under the cottonwoods and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she recognized from the schoolhouse, that careful honesty. "Grace," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name, and it landed with a weight that surprised her. "Yes," she said. "I know you came here on your own terms," he said. "I know what that means to you, and I don't want to be another person trying to redirect your life according to someone else's idea of what it should look like." He paused, turning his hat in his hands in the way he did when he was choosing his words carefully. "But I've spent 6 months trying to talk myself out of what I feel for you, and I'm not having much success, and I think honesty serves us better than pretending." She looked at him, at this earnest, careful man standing in the golden October light with his hat in his hands. "I love you," he said simply. "I don't say that as a demand or a claim. I say it because it's true and because you deserve honesty." The cottonwood leaves moved in the wind. The creek made its small sound. She stepped forward and she put her hand against his jaw, which was warm and slightly rough, and she looked up at him. "I love you too," she said. "That is both the most surprising and the least surprising thing that has happened to me since I came to Kansas." The sound he made was halfway between a breath and a laugh, and then he took her face in both his hands and kissed her, gently and completely, in a way that felt like something being named for the first time. They rode back to town in the long gold light of late afternoon, and she was aware of a change in the quality of the world, the way you are aware of it after rain, everything the same and everything different. November arrived with the first real cold, and with it a complication. The school board met in the first week of November, and Harold Prentice came to her with an expression that sat uneasily on his usually cheerful face. She sat across from him in his store while he turned a pencil in his fingers and explained that the board had received a letter from a member who was concerned about the propriety of an unmarried female teacher conducting what the member described as a very public and conspicuous courtship. She listened to this without expression until he was finished. "Who sent the letter?" she said. "Mrs. Delmont," Prentice said, with the air of a man who had been expecting exactly this question. Grace knew Mrs. Delmont, a small, precise woman whose eldest son was not one of her students, because Mrs. Delmont had decided that Grace's methods were too unconventional. Mrs. Delmont had opinions about the proper conduct of unmarried women that were both firmly held and liberally shared. "And the board's position," Grace said. "The board's position," Prentice said carefully, "is that Mrs. Delmont's concerns are noted, and that the board has every confidence in the professional conduct of their teacher, and that so long as said teacher's personal life does not impinge upon her professional duties, the board considers the matter closed." He set down the pencil. "That is the official position. And unofficially," she said, "unofficially, you have been here 8 months and turned 14 children into readers, and the whole town knows it, and Mrs. Delmont can write all the letters she likes." He said this with a satisfaction that suggested this was not merely his personal opinion but a broad consensus. "I just thought you should know the letter existed." "Thank you, Harold," she said. She went home and sat with the letter's existence for an evening and concluded several things. She concluded that Mrs. Delmont was not going to determine the course of her life. She concluded that her professional conduct was and had always been impeccable, and she had nothing to apologize for. She concluded that she was, if anything, more determined than before to do exactly as she pleased within the bounds of her own considerable sense of what was right. She also concluded, sitting in the lamplight with these thoughts, that she was going to have a serious conversation with Reuben. She found him the next evening at Mrs. Hale's supper gathering, and she told him about the letter matter-of-factly because he deserved to know. He listened, and his expression moved through several things in sequence, and then he said, "I'm sorry. I didn't intend to cause you professional difficulty." "You haven't," she said. "Harold and the board have handled it. I'm telling you because I don't want there to be things we don't say to each other." He looked at her steadily. "I appreciate that. There is something else," she said. "Yes." She took a breath and said what she had been thinking about since she left Prentice's store. "I love you. I have said that, and I am not going back on it." She met his eyes. "But I am not willing to be in a position where my professional standing is perpetually vulnerable to someone like Mrs. Delmont who can write letters whenever she feels like it. The solution to that is not to be less of who I am. It's not to be less conspicuous or less public or less anything." She paused. "The solution, as I see it, is for the board to have no grounds for concern, which means either we conduct our courtship in a way that remains subject to this kind of criticism indefinitely, or we don't." He was very still. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he said carefully. "I'm saying," she said, with the steadiness she brought to every true thing, "that if you were to ask me to marry you, I would have an answer ready." The look on his face was extraordinary. There was a moment where everything in it moved at once, and then he reached into his coat pocket and produced, to her complete astonishment, a small ring. It was a simple thing, silver with a single small stone, and he held it in his palm and looked at her. "I bought this in September," he said quietly. She stared at the ring. She stared at him. "September. I was waiting for the right time," he said. "I was going to wait until I was sure you were sure." "I'm sure," she said. "Then, Grace Cooper," he said, "will you marry me, with the full understanding that you are a school teacher and that is not going to change, and that whatever we build together is built around both of our lives and neither of us has to diminish themselves to fit into it?" Her eyes were doing something embarrassing, and she was not going to apologize for it. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly yes." He put the ring on her finger, there at Mrs. Hale's supper table, with half the neighborhood watching in delighted attention, and Mrs. Hale made a sound that was approximately a sob of satisfaction, and Abigail Monroe, who had apparently been at the gathering, said loudly and with absolute vindication, "I knew it." The wedding was on a Saturday in December 1878, a clear cold day with frost on the ground, and a sky so blue it looked like something someone had painted rather than something natural. The ceremony was held in the church on Elm Street, which Grace had not frequently attended, but which had a preacher she respected. A quiet, plain-spoken man named Reverend Calloway, who had delivered sermons she found intellectually honest if occasionally incomplete. She wore her best dress, dark blue wool that she had ordered fabric for from the general store, and that Mrs. Alcott, the mother of her student Thomas, had sewn with extraordinary skill. She carried a small bunch of dried prairie flowers because fresh flowers were not to be had in December in Kansas, and she thought the dried ones had a beauty of their own, the honest beauty of things that had lasted. She walked herself down the aisle because her father was gone and her mother could not travel, and because it seemed to her the truest way to mark what she was doing, arriving at this marriage as herself, whole and choosing. Reuben stood at the front of the church in his good suit with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not simply happiness, though it was that. It was the expression of a man who recognized something true when he saw it coming toward him. Reverend Calloway read from Ruth, which Grace had requested, because she found the language of Ruth and Naomi's loyalty more honest about commitment than some of the more commonly used passages. "Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die." The utter willingness to build a life somewhere alongside someone. She said her vows in a clear voice, looking at Reuben directly, meaning every word with the full weight of her considered choice. He said his vows in the same way, looking at her, and she heard in his voice the same quality of deliberateness, the same sense that these words were being spoken after thought rather than in the suspension of it. Thomas Alcott was there with his mother, and he read a short poem during the ceremony that he had memorized, because Grace had taught him that a person who could read could do anything, and he stood at the front of the church with his chin up and delivered every word without stumbling once. Mrs. Hale cried. Abigail Monroe did not cry, but watched the proceedings with the satisfied expression of a scientist whose hypothesis has been confirmed. Harold Prentice shook Reuben's hand afterward with both of his and told Grace she was the best thing that had happened to the school since the school existed, which was his highest possible compliment. They had the wedding supper at Mrs. Hale's because it seemed appropriate, and the whole street came, and there was enough food for twice the number of people, and someone had produced a fiddle player, and the small back parlor was warm and full of voices, and Grace stood in the middle of it with her hand in Reuben's and thought, with a completeness she had not expected, that this was it. This was the thing she had been building toward, without knowing it, in all the years of planning and working and deciding who she was. Not the wedding, not the marriage even, the life. The full life that had room for all of it, the work and the love and the place and the people. The life that was entirely her own because she had chosen every part of it. Reuben bent his head close to hers in the noise and warmth of the party and said, "Happy." "Extraordinarily," she said. They moved into a house on Cedar Street in January, a small house with 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a good stone fireplace, and a window in the front room that looked west toward the open prairie. Grace took the 2nd bedroom as her study, which Reuben had suggested without being asked, because he understood without needing. It explained that a woman who read and planned and thought the way she did needed a room of her own. She put her books in it and her desk, and the illustrated natural history he had given her, and she worked there in the mornings before school and in the evenings, and it was one of the particular pleasures of her life. She kept her position at the school, which the board affirmed in writing after the marriage, making the question moot. Mrs. Delmont wrote no further letters on the subject, presumably because there was now nothing left to object to. Grace returned to the schoolroom each morning with the same focus and intention she had brought to it from the first day, and her students continued to be the best and most complicated part of her professional life. The winter of 1879 was hard, the way Kansas winters could be, with snow that arrived in late January and stayed, and temperatures that turned the water in the pump to ice and made the morning walk to the schoolhouse an exercise in endurance. Grace started the stove an hour before the children arrived and kept it going all day, and she shortened the walk time by organizing the children who lived in the same direction into groups that walked together, because she had read about children lost in blizzards, and she was not going to add that experience to her list. She discovered that winter that Reuben was, as a husband, precisely who he had been as a person she was learning to know, which was, she suspected, not as common a thing as it should have been. He was direct and honest and present. He did his share of the domestic work without being asked, which was not a small thing in 1879, and he did it without making her feel as though she owed him something for it. He listened to her talk about her work with the same genuine interest he had always shown, and he talked about his own work with the same directness. The complications of law enforcement in a cattle town, the particular balances of authority and restraint that the job required. They argued sometimes, because two people with strong opinions who are honest with each other will argue sometimes, and their arguments were real arguments, with genuine heat and occasional frustration, and they were also arguments that resolved into understanding rather than silence. She discovered that she liked arguing with him, not the conflict itself but the quality of it, two people who respected each other enough to disagree fully and to come out the other side clearer than they had been before. In February of 1879, she sat down with him after supper and told him she was pregnant. The look on his face moved through surprise and then something she could only describe as a kind of dazzled joy, the expression of a person who has received something they hadn't known they needed until it arrived. "Are you all right?" he said immediately, practically, which was the right first question. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I'm a healthy woman and I intend to keep teaching until I can no longer do so without disruption." "All right," he said. "I mean that," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I wouldn't expect anything else." She taught until June, which was when her condition became sufficiently visible that she judged it would become a subject of distraction for her students, and she handed the classroom to a temporary teacher that she had personally trained over the preceding months, a young woman named Clara who had been one of the older students and who showed genuine aptitude. She was not entirely graceful about stepping back. She missed the classroom with a specific physical quality, the smell of chalk and the sound of children working, the small particular victories. She channeled the energy into writing the most comprehensive teacher's notes she had ever produced, a complete curriculum guide that Clara could follow, and into reading everything she could find on the subject of education, and into the project of making the house on Cedar Street ready for its expansion. Her son was born in August of 1879, during the same heat that she had survived the year before, and he arrived with the emphatic quality of someone who had places to be. He was healthy and loud and had his father's eyes and her mother's chin, and Grace held him for the first time with the specific marvel of a thing that could not be entirely anticipated. No amount of reading or rational consideration fully prepared you for the fact of a child, for the sheer improbable reality of it. They named him James, after Reuben's father, with Thomas as a middle name, for reasons that were both sentimental and practically significant. She told Thomas Alcott at the end of his school term, now a confident reader who had moved on to chapter books, that he had a small namesake, and Thomas went slightly red and looked at the floor, and then looked up with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pride that was one of her favorite things she had ever seen. She went back to teaching in October when James was 7 weeks old, with the school board's support and Mrs. Hale's agreement to watch the baby during school hours, an arrangement that Mrs. Hale accepted with such enthusiasm that Grace suspected she had been waiting to be asked. The house on Cedar Street was 3 blocks from the schoolhouse, which meant she could nurse James at the midday break and return to her students without missing any portion of the afternoon session. It was not easy. There were mornings when the combination of a restless infant and lesson plans, and the demands of running a household felt like too many things pulling in too many directions. There were evenings when she sat at her desk in the study too tired to form a complete thought. There were moments when she felt the particular guilt of a woman who loves her child completely and also loves her work completely, and is aware that the world expects these two things to be in competition with each other. She talked to Reuben about this on a December evening with James asleep in the other room and snow coming down outside the window, and he listened and then said, "You don't have to choose between them. They're both yours." "Society has an opinion about that," she said. "Society has an opinion about most things worth doing," he said. "What do you think?" She thought about it genuinely. "I think I am a better teacher because I'm a mother. And I think I'm a better mother because I have work that is entirely mine. And I think both of those things make me better for James and for you." "Then that's the answer," he said. She looked at him across the lamplight. "You are a profoundly reasonable man." "I am a man in love with a profoundly determined woman," he said. Reasonableness seemed like the practical approach. She laughed and he laughed, and James stirred in the other room and then settled, and the snow came down outside the window on Cedar Street in Caldwell, Kansas, and she was warm and known and entirely herself. 1880 moved through its seasons with the rhythm that Caldwell had established for her. The school year and the cattle season, and the winter quiet and the spring beginning. And she came to understand this rhythm as something precious, the particular texture of a life lived in a real place with real people who had accumulated meaning over time. The town itself was changing, as it was always changing in those years. The end of the Kishom Trail era was beginning to be felt. The cattle trade was shifting, and the town was adapting, growing into something more settled, more permanent, the wild edge of it smoothing slightly even as the essential character held. She had been teaching for 2 years now in Caldwell, and she had stories about every student who had ever come through her door. Thomas, who could read anything, Abigail Monroe, who was writing her own essays now, 7-year-olds who had arrived unable to recognize a single letter, and who were now working through their second reader. She had built a lending library in the corner of the schoolhouse, using donated books and some of her own. The first lending library in the county, which Harold Prentice wrote up in the town paper with a pride that made her smile. She was sitting in the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1880 when the door opened and Reuben came in with the particular quality of step that she had learned to read as something happened. "What is it?" she said. He sat across from her and looked at her with care. "I have news," he said, "and I want you to have the chance to say what you think before I tell you my own response to it." This was the quality of attention she had married. "Tell me," she said. "The sheriff has decided to retire," he said. "He told me this morning he's recommending me for the position." "Sheriff," she said. "I haven't accepted," he said. "I wanted to talk to you first." She looked at him steadily. "Why, it's your career. It's the natural progression of your work. Because being sheriff in Caldwell is not the same as being deputy," he said. "It's more responsibility and more visibility, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't also more risk, and those things affect you as much as they affect me." She was quiet for a moment because she loved him for saying it and because it deserved a genuine response. "Reuben," she said, "I think you should be the best sheriff this town has ever had." "That is what I think." She paused. "And you are going to come home every night because I will expect it." He exhaled slowly, and the tension went out of his shoulders, and he reached across her desk and took her hand. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "Now go tell the sheriff yes before he offers it to someone else." He was appointed sheriff of Caldwell in May of 1880, and she attended the small ceremony at the county courthouse where he was formally sworn in, with James on her hip and Reverend Calloway in the front row and Harold Prentice looking like a proud uncle. Reuben stood at the front of the room in his good suit and said his oath of office in a clear voice, and she watched him and felt the specific pride of a woman who knows the person she loves, who has seen them at every angle and in every light, and still finds them worth watching. He pinned the sheriff's badge to his vest afterward and looked across the room at her. And she held James up slightly so the baby could see. And James grabbed at the air in the general direction of his father with the enthusiastic lack of precision of a 9-month-old. And Reuben laughed the real laugh she kept in a private catalog of the best sounds in the world. Summer brought the cattle drives and the attendant complexity, and now Reuben managed it from the top of the structure rather than the middle, which meant different responsibilities and different stresses. And she learned to read the shape of his days in the same way she had always read the shape of her own. She kept the school. She kept her lending library and her curriculum notes and her professional correspondence with the State Board of Education, which she had developed into a regular channel, sending letters about the needs of rural schools and the necessity of qualified teachers and the chronic underfunding of frontier education. Her second child was born in November of 1880, a daughter this time, with Grace's stubbornness and Reuben's eyes, and a quality of watchful attention from approximately her second week of life that made everyone who met her slightly uneasy in the best possible way. They named her Margaret, after Grace's mother, with Elspeth as a middle name for Mrs. Hale, who cried for approximately 20 minutes when she was told. Mrs. Hale herself was at the house on Cedar Street at least 3 times a week, a fact that Grace found deeply comforting and occasionally overwhelming, and overwhelmingly comforting in the end. She was a grandmother in every sense that mattered, a source of accumulated wisdom and extraordinary cooking, and the particular reassurance of someone who had seen more of life than you had, and was not frightened by it. With 2 small children and a full teaching position, and the demands of being a sheriff's wife, Grace's life in the early part of 1881 was full in the way that can feel either suffocating or rich depending on the day and the quality of your sleep. She had days when she arrived at the schoolhouse with a clarity of purpose that felt like the best version of herself, and days when she sat at her desk in the study after the children were in bed and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman carrying multiple lives simultaneously. She wrote about this because she had always written, keeping journals since she was 14 years old, and the journal she kept in those years was one of the most honest documents of her inner life she had ever produced. She wrote about the tension between freedom and responsibility, about what it meant to have built exactly what she wanted, and to find that it was both better and harder than she had imagined. She wrote about Reuben with the privacy of the page, the specific qualities of loving him, the ways in which he continued to surprise her, and the ways in which his constancy was its own kind of gift. She wrote one evening in the spring of 1881, "I came here to work, not to wed. That was true, and it remains true. What I did not know then, and know entirely now, is that those things were never in opposition. I simply had not yet met the particular person who would make that clear." The Kishom Trail formally closed to cattle drives in 1884, as Kansas passed legislation restricting the movement of Texas longhorns, and Caldwell adjusted as towns do, finding new purpose in its own permanent population, in farming and trade and the steady accretion of civic life. The wild energy of the trail years settled into something quieter and more lasting, and Grace watched this transformation with the interest of someone who had arrived at the tail end of one era and was watching the next one begin. She was by 1884 a known figure in the town and beyond it. The State Board of Education had published one of her curriculum guides as a recommended resource for rural schools across Kansas, and she had received correspondence from teachers in other parts of the territory who were using her materials. Harold Prentice had written a longer piece about her lending library that had been picked up by a paper in Wichita, and she had been asked to speak at the county teachers' gathering, which she had done with the directness and practical intelligence that characterized everything she put her mind to. She was 30 now, and she felt 30 in the best sense, sure of herself and her work in a way that 23-year-old Grace stepping off the stagecoach had been reaching for but not yet fully inhabiting. She had earned the sureness the way you earn things that matter, by doing the work and staying in it even when it was hard. James was 5 years old by 1884 and already in her school, which she had anticipated would be complicated, but which turned out to be entirely manageable because James was his father's son in temperament, taking things as they came with an even quality that she found both admirable and occasionally baffling. Margaret, at 3, was already demonstrating the kind of determined independence that her parents recognized with a mix of pride and rueful acknowledgement. On a spring evening in 1884, she and Reuben sat on the front porch of the house on Cedar Street with the prairie stretched out in front of them and the long gold light of the Kansas evening lying over everything. And James was in the yard chasing something, a grasshopper or a shadow, and Margaret was asleep inside, and the whole improbable constructed fullness of their life lay around them like something they had built with their hands. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the first time we met?" He considered. "I said you looked like someone who'd been told the hotel was full." "You said I looked like I was following my own dream," she said. "I did say that," he said. She looked out at James in the yard at the prairie beyond. "I was terrified," she said, "standing on that street with my trunk and my teaching certificate. I was absolutely certain of what I wanted and absolutely uncertain whether I could have it." "You didn't look terrified," he said. "I know," she said. "I have a reliable face." He laughed quietly. "You do." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm move around her, and thought about the long distance between that first day on the main street of Caldwell and this porch in the spring evening, and all the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in between, the students and the seasons and the arguments and the quiet mornings over coffee and the nights when the children were restless, and the nights when the house was entirely still, and everything felt entirely sufficient. "Are you happy?" He said the same question he had asked at Mrs. Hale's supper on their wedding day. She thought about it in the specific way she thought about things that mattered, turning it over, examining it, not settling for a convenient answer. "I am the happiest I know how to be," she said, "and I think I'm still learning how to be happier." He kissed her hair. "Good," he said. The following year, Reuben was re-elected sheriff without opposition, which spoke both to his ability and to the high regard in which Caldwell held him. He had managed the transition out of the cattle drive era with a steady hand, keeping the peace during the economic disruption that followed the end of the trail traffic, building relationships with the farming families who were increasingly the backbone of the town's economy, earning a reputation across the county for the particular combination of fairness and backbone that good law enforcement required. Grace had expanded the school's enrollment as more farming families settled in the surrounding area, and she had hired Clara, her former student, as a permanent second teacher, the two of them dividing the younger and older students between them, and she had written to the state board about the possibility of funding a second-room addition to the schoolhouse. The request had been approved in the spring of 1885, and she had overseen the construction with the same practical precision she brought to everything, specifying the window placement for light and the door placement for air circulation, and insisting on proper shelving installed from the beginning rather than added as an afterthought. Abigail Monroe, who had been her student in that first year, was 19 by 1885. And she came to Grace on a summer morning with a letter of acceptance from the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia, where she intended to train as a teacher herself. She stood in the front room of the house on Cedar Street with the letter in her hand and looked at Grace with an expression that contained about 7 years of accumulated admiration that she had never directly expressed but which Grace had always been aware of. "You started this," Abigail said. "You know that." "You started this," Grace said. "I just made the materials available." Abigail shook her head. "You showed up," she said. "That first day, with your name on the blackboard and the dead mouse gone, you showed up and you were exactly who you were supposed to be, and that is what I've been trying to do ever since." Grace felt something move in her that she did not try to manage. She stood up and embraced Abigail Monroe, who had been 12 years old and too sharp for the limited resources available to her, and who was now going to spend her life making other children's futures larger. "Go learn everything," Grace said. "Come back and tell me about it." By the late summer of 1885, with James 6 years old and Margaret 4, and the school expanded, and the house on Cedar Street more full of life than it had ever been, Grace had reached a kind of equilibrium that felt not like stasis, but like the solid ground from which things continued to grow. She had stopped bracing for the compromise that she had always expected, the erosion of herself that she had watched happen to the women in her life. It had not come. She was, if anything, more fully herself at 31 than she had been at 23, and the difference was not despite the marriage and the children and the years, but partly because of them. There were still hard days. There were days when the school board was obstinate about funding, when a student's family moved away before she had finished what she needed to teach them, when the work felt thankless in the specific way that teaching sometimes did. There were days when the house was too small and too loud, and the demands of everyone who loved her felt like they were coming from every direction simultaneously. There were days when Reuben came home from work with the particular quiet of a man who has dealt with something that cost him something, and she sat with him in the evening and did not try to fix it, just kept company in the dark until it was lighter. But there were also mornings when she stood at the front of her classroom, still her classroom, 6 years in, and looked at the rows of faces looking back at her with that watchful Western attention, and felt the clean, entire satisfaction of a person doing exactly what they were built to do. There were evenings on the Cedar Street porch with the prairie rolling away in front of them, and her husband's hand in hers, and the sound of their children inside the house behind them. There were winter afternoons in the study with a cup of coffee and a book, and the particular silence of a house where everyone was contentedly occupied elsewhere. There were moments in the middle of ordinary things, washing the breakfast dishes or walking to school or helping Margaret sound out her first words, when she was aware of her life as a whole thing, assembled from all its pieces, and found it exactly right. In September of 1885, Grace Cooper Donovan received a formal letter from the Kansas State Board of Education, commending her contribution to rural education in Sumner County, and requesting her participation in a state committee developing curriculum standards for frontier schools. She read the letter at her desk in the study and thought about the woman who had packed a teaching certificate into her coat pocket and stepped off a stagecoach in a dusty town at the edge of everything, certain only about what she wanted and not yet certain she could have it. She wrote back accepting the appointment. She told Reuben at supper that evening, passing the letter across the table, and he read it and looked up at her with that smile that still, after 6 years, had the quality of the first time she had seen it, the transformation of his face, the particular warmth. "State committee," he said. "Apparently," she said. "Grace Cooper changing the world one school at a time," he said. "Starting with this county," she said. He handed the letter back. "I'll be here when you come home from the meetings," he said. "I know you will," she said. She picked up her fork, and he picked up his fork, and James asked about something he had seen that day, with the earnest thoroughness of a 6-year-old reporting important events, and Margaret pushed her carrots to the edge of her plate with the hopeful patience of a child who believes strategic positioning might achieve what direct objection has not, and the evening settled around the table in the way of evenings that are ordinary and therefore everything. She had come west to work. She had not come west to wed. And she had ended up, in the fullness of a life she had built with careful hands and her whole determined heart, with both, and with more than both, with a home and a town, and a place in the history of what was being built here on the edge of the prairie. She had ended up with students who would carry what she had given them into lives she would never entirely see, and a husband who had never once asked her to be less than she was, and children who were already becoming themselves in ways that delighted and surprised her. She had ended up with the life she had always wanted, because she had never stopped believing she was allowed to want it, and she had found a man who believed the same thing. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough. It was, in every meaning of the word she could think of, everything. The cottonwood trees along the creek south of Caldwell turned gold every October, and every October Grace noticed them from the window of the schoolhouse, the same trees where Reuben had told her something true with his hat in his hands and changed the course of both their lives. She had taken her students to those trees in the natural science lesson every fall for 6 years running, showing them the way the cottonwood seeds would drift in the spring, showing them the root systems and the water table, and the way these particular trees were part of the prairie's hidden architecture. In October of 1885, she took the class out there as she always did, with the illustrated natural history book tucked under one arm, and James came along because he was old enough now to be part of the class rather than just the teacher's son. And she stood under those gold-leaf trees with her students around her, and the sky immense above them, and thought about the particular grace of a life that circles back to its own good places. She would come back to these trees every year for as long as she taught. She would bring every class she ever had, in the years that stretched forward from 1885 into a future she could not entirely see but could partially imagine, the town growing and changing, the prairie remaining, the school expanding, her students going out into the world and doing things she had helped make possible. She would come back to these trees with Reuben on a Sunday afternoon in November when the leaves were nearly gone, and stand with him in the cold, clear air, and say nothing because nothing needed saying. She would come back to these trees with James at 12 when he was old enough to hear the story of how his parents had stood in this exact place and told each other true things, and he would listen with the earnest attention of his father and ask 2 good questions, and then chase a rabbit across the creek bank and come back muddy and unrepentant. She would come back with Margaret at 10 and again at 13, and Margaret would stand under these trees with the stillness that was entirely her own, that watchful contemplative quality, and look at the prairie stretching away and say, in the voice that was already her mother's voice in its directness, that she wanted to be a doctor, and Grace would say that there was no reason in the world she couldn't be. But all of that was ahead of her. For now, in October of 1885, she stood under the cottonwood trees with 23 children and her own son among them, and the gold light came through the leaves and fell on all of them, and she held the illustrated natural history book and began to teach. She had come west to work. She had found, along the way, every reason to stay.